Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Ableton device mini-series tutorials. I'm Mr. Bill and I'm basically doing a small series on all the Ableton devices. So part 1 was about filters, part 2 was about dynamics processors, and now we're on to part 3, which is all about time-based effects. So time-based effects are effects that deal with time basically. So we're looking at things like choruses and flanges and delays and ping pong delays, grain delays, reverbs, all that sort of stuff that affects the signal over time. I've included autopan in this, although it's not a traditional time-based effect. I thought it fits into this category, I guess, better than any of the other categories that I'll be doing. So we'll start on autopan. Basically what it is it's two LFOs, one for the left speaker, one for the right speaker. Here we can see that the left speaker is marked in red and the right speaker is marked in yellow. Um, and essentially that's pretty much all it does. It just throws the signal between the left and the right speaker. So if we turn the amount right down, this is like any other LFO, we have an amount, so this is how much it gets thrown between the left and the right speaker. And I'll just duplicate this sample a few times so we can hear what it's doing, because at the moment it's just a clapping sample, so all as we get is this, which isn't going to really help us for what I want to show. So I'll just play this, and with the amount all the way down, it'll sound mono, it'll sound like it's in the center. And as I start turning this amount up, it starts getting thrown between the left and the right speaker. So I'll just do that. So you can see how it's panning between the left and the right speaker. You can actually see it in the levels here. The signal going between the left and the right speakers. And then we have rate, and this basically speeds up how quickly the signal's going from the left to the right speaker. And it almost creates a slicing effect for us. So the other parameters on this are all kind of weird things. So we have normal, and this just switches left to right and right to left, in case you want to do that for whatever reason. Phase just inverts the polarity, or it changes the polarity of the left and the right LFOs. So at 360 degrees or 0 degrees, they're perfectly in phase, and at 180 degrees, they're perfectly out of phase, so they're doing the exact opposite things. So if we put it at 360 degrees, we'll hear both sides of the signal doing the exact same thing, like this, which almost creates a tremolo. And that's even more of a sliced effect for us. Then we have this hertz and note value. This is basically a sync rate and a hertz rate, like in most LFOs, and then an offset value, which basically offsets the start of where these note values are starting from. And on hertz, you don't have that option. You have a spin and a phase option, which kind of changes the left and the right side a little bit differently again. And then we have a shape option, which just shapes the types of waves that we're panning with, and then we have a couple of different waves to choose from. So we have a complex wave, a triangle wave, saw waves, and sine waves. So if we go saw waves, and then we'll just turn this amount all the way up, we'll put it completely in phase, and then we'll start messing with the rate, and this should create a pretty decent sliced effect for us. So that's kind of a gate. If we put it on a complex wave, it'll create just a really weird sort of effect for us. And we have a width option now that we're on complex wave, and that just does all sorts of weird things between the left and the right speaker. So we'll listen to that. So that's kind of an interesting one. So yeah, that's basically what the autopan does. So we'll keep moving on now. We'll go to chorus next. So for this, I'll just make it one single sample rather than lots of duplicated samples. So what a chorus does is it basically puts the left and the right side of the mix out of time with each other, if that sort of makes sense. Like, so if we have a look here, we can have delay 1 and delay 2. We can imagine this to be two copies of the signal. So we have the first delay 1.21 milliseconds, the second delay 3 milliseconds. So it's like we're hearing two versions of the signal. So if I create another track like this, and then I have this one here, and then I have a copy of that playing 1 millisecond later, which is where about here somewhere. Oops, let's grab that. Roughly there, and then I'll create another one and I'll put that 4 milliseconds later. And then if I put high passes on these and turn them down, that's similar to what we're doing. Creating, oh, should I turn that off? Just delete this MIDI track. So it kind of sounds a bit phasey. It's a way of creating nice thick sounding guitars and vocals and stuff like that. I'll just turn the feedback down. So we have an amount and a rate and this times 20 button, and then a few options for delay 2 and a high pass. So at the moment it kind of sounds like a few samples are playing at once. It layers them up. If we turn that off, we can hear that it's just one. Now it sounds like 3, like I just did when I was copying the other samples. So it sounds like there's one playing and then 1.21 milliseconds later another one's playing, and then 3.4 milliseconds later another one's playing. The second one has a high pass, the first instance of the copied signal that we're hearing has a high pass of 192 Hz on it, and we can turn that all the way up to 15 kilohertz. And then delay 2 has an off, fix and mod option. So with the mod option, basically we have this modulation parameter in this XY container here, and it just has an amount and a rate option, which is similar to the LFOs on anything else we're going to look at. It just modulates, I guess, the delay time a little bit, so we don't just have 1.21 milliseconds, it actually goes up to 1.6 and down to 0.8 and such, and moves around. So we have this modulation option, and it only affects delay 1. If we have delay 2 turned off, then the modulation on that over here in this mod box that affects delay 1 doesn't affect delay 2. If we have it on fix, it delays both of them the same, and if we have it on modulation, it affects delay 1 and then delay 2. So we'll just turn it off, and then we'll turn it on. So it sounds a bit more modulated, a bit less boring. Then we have a feedback option. It's kind of like the feedbacks on the delays. It takes the output source and it feeds it back into the input source, so we get the same thing repeating a few times. Oh, that sounds kind of weird. And then we have this times 20 button down here, just down the bottom. It says star 20, and that means multiply by 20. So it multiplies these amounts here by 20. So if we turn that on, it'll be a lot crazier. So it just sounds really, really modulated now. Alright, so I'll turn the feedback down a bit. And then we have this equals button here in the middle of both of these delay times. So if I click on that, we can modulate them both at the same time. Or if I unclick it, we have separate control over both of those. So it kind of produces comb filtering in a sense. Just makes stuff sound a bit thicker and a bit nicer sometimes. Alright, so moving on. The next thing is a filter delay. So essentially a filter delay, we have a filter, like an EQ in the center of the delay, and we have the left and right sides and the middle. So if I turn the left and right sides off and we just leave the middle on and open this bandpass, bandpass filter all the way up, we basically just have a regular delay, or I can just turn that filter off and it'll just go straight through into the sync rates and then out to the feedbacks, the pans, the volumes, etc. I'll just put this volume at 0 dB, same as the rest of them, and I'll put all the feedbacks at say 50%, just so we get a bit of evenness. So left plus right, if we listen to this, we'll just have a sync time of 4 at 130 BPM. So it just sounds like a regular delay, but then we can turn this bandpass filter on, we can drag it up so it's cutting, I can't really tell where it's cutting because the point that it moves from, like the pole is at the other end, so I know that the highest point is 18K, but I'm not exactly sure where the middle point is. Then we have our Q value just here, which is a boost at the cutoff point. I think it's kind of silly that it works from this side. It should really work from the cutoff point. However, what it does anyway is it just feeds the output source. Well, it cuts this frequency here, which I assume is around 1 kilohertz or something. It cuts that frequency, so the first delayed signal that we hear back is slightly filtered. And then if we have a feedback mode on, it outputs that source back into the input and then it filters it again. So the second one's twice as filtered, then it outputs it back into the input, filters it again, so it's 3 times more filtered. Oops, I'll just stop that from looping and play it for you, and you'll see what I mean. Like, the first signal is filtered, and the second one's more filtered, and the third one's more filtered. And the reason why that is because it keeps going out the input, back in the out the output and back in the input, and then keeps going through the same filter, creating more and more filtering. So you can see how it keeps getting high pass there. And then we have a left and a right option, and they're by default pan to left and right, although we can put those in the middle, I believe, yes. And just make them normal delays too, but we want to make them left and right. And I'll put these both on sync mode, and then it's kind of like the simple delay. We have two different delays happening in both separate speakers, and then different filters for both of them. So you can create cool little things with that. And then a cool little trick with this is to turn both of these sync modes onto time mode, and then have one side, say, playing at 3 milliseconds and the other side playing at 5 or let's say 6 milliseconds. And it just makes it sound nice and wide and kind of comb filtered again. And the reason why this is just because we hear it at slightly different times in both speakers, but our ears aren't acute enough to pick up the slight difference in delays between them, so we get like a false sense of widening happening. It's called interaural time difference. And then we have this value at the end here, which basically just makes it louder or quieter. We can generally leave that at minus infinity because the volumes on these last ones are 0 dB anyway. So moving on, the next thing we have is the flanger. And this is kind of similar to what we're doing with the chorus and the filter delay. It puts the signal out of time and repeats itself a few times. Like we have delay times here. If we turn this right up to 7 milliseconds, that's a 7 millisecond delay time, which we could recreate with a ping pong delay if we wanted. We turn this time on to 7 milliseconds. Let's turn that off. It's kind of a similar thing, although this one has a bit more of a twang to it, and I think that's because of this high pass. And it has a feedback of 99, whereas the ping pong only feeds back up to 95. So then we have this envelope, and the envelope kind of works like the ones on the compressors. The attack is the same, means how quick before it starts to affect it, and release how long after it initially affects it, how long it lays off the effect. And this envelope is automatically routed to this delay time. So if we have, let's say we have it at, we'll just put it in the middle, let's say 7 milliseconds, we'll turn the envelope all the way up to 100%. Then we'll turn the attack of the envelope down to 10 milliseconds and the release up to 130 milliseconds, and we'll just play that. So it's going, it's basically just modulating this delay time for us. So if we take this delay time, I'll just try and modulate this from here up to its maximum value in 130 milliseconds. So I'll just find 130 milliseconds, probably be around here somewhere. So I'll just modulate that all the way up, and then I'll take this envelope down and we can listen to that. Oops, maybe it has to go the other way. So I'll make this one maximum, this one 70. It's kind of exactly what I was doing for us. It's modulating it for us, so we don't have to mess with that automation. We can just turn the envelope up and mess with the release and attacks. So you can get some cool stuff happening there. The negative and positive, that's just the polarity. And then I'll just repeat this a few times so we can play with the LFO a bit. So the LFO is very similar to the one on the auto pan or any device. It has an amount, has a rate and a phase, which is basically works the same way as this auto pan. It has a few different shapes on it: sine, square, triangle, saw up, saw down, and complex. And basically this is just the shape in which it LFOs it. So if we have it on saw up, for instance, we can imagine that as being the delay time getting modulated like that and then sucking back down and back up again, and that's pretty much how it modulates in there. And then we can imagine the same thing for every other one. So if it was saw down, it would be modulating like that, and then as we turn the amount up, these modulations would get bigger like that. And then a sine wave is, a sine wave shape, all that sort of stuff. So if we just try that LFO out now, I'll just put it onto a saw up shape, and I'll just start playing with this rate and this amount. It's kind of glitchy, I'll just duplicate these a bit further back. I might just put this in a sampler, and what I'll do is I'll show you a quick trick. I'll open up a MIDI track, I'll take this clap sample and I'll throw it in a sampler by going to my live devices and going sampler, then putting this in here. And then what I'll do is I'll find 2 zero crossings at about the same volume. So let's say just there, and just there. And then I'll put the sustain mode onto this one here with the forward and backwards arrow. I'll just get my loop point up there. So basically what's going to happen now is the sample's going to play forward, and then as soon as it hits this endpoint it's going to reverse and play back on itself, so that'll create like an endless oscillating sound for us. So I'll just see what that sounds like. I'll just create a note. Yep, that's good, that's what we want. We want an oscillator. So now I'll put this flanger on that track just by dragging it on there. So now we can hear that shape, that saw wave shape going whoop, 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 and just pushing the values up for us, and we can do saw down as well. Or sine wave's a bit smoother. Square is just an on-off sound. And complex is kind of random. It's pretty cool. And then we have this high pass again, and it cuts the input as it goes back in with the feedback, so we don't get this big bass build-ups like we do if we turn it down. If we turn that up, it'll be a bit lighter. And then yeah, phase is the same thing, puts the left and right out of phase. 360 or 0 puts them in phase, and 180 is perfectly out of phase like the auto pan. And then yeah, rate, how fast or how slow it modulates, and that's about it. So moving on, we have the frequency shifter. I'll put that on the oscillating sound we have going, delete that. So the frequency shifter basically it shifts frequencies. So we have an LFO on this, we have a frequency knob, we have a fine, and we have a drive and a ring modulator and a width mode and a phase mode and some rates and such. So if I just play this, basically if we start turning the rate up, it'll start turning the frequency up and down. We could do the same thing if we had an oscillator just by turning an LFO up on the pitch of the oscillator. So I'll just start turning this up, we'll listen to it. So you can hear how the frequency is going up and down really crazy. I'll just turn that amount back down. I won't explain the LFOs 100% every time because we've already gone through them, and they're essentially the same thing every time. They have a shape, they have a note value, a hertz value, an offset, a phase when you're in note value, and phase and spin or phase mode. And then we have frequency or ring modulation, and a drive mode if we're in ring modulation, and a width mode which just spreads the signal out a bit. So within ring modulation mode, this is kind of interesting. Say we have a C. I'll just go to my notebook, my dashboard, and we'll just type in C, C3, MIDI note 60, 261 hertz. So let's say we have 261 hertz, and we turn this frequency up to, let's say, I don't know, let's say that we turn the frequency up on the spread to 100 hertz, and we have it on ring modulation. Basically what's going to happen now is it's going to take 100 hertz from 261 hertz, and it's going to add 100 hertz to 261 hertz, so you'll have 361 and 161. So you get this weird like sound of 3 frequencies happening. Then we have a drive mode, it's just like a distortion and a mix dry wet sort of value for that drive. If we turn that off, it just becomes a dry wet value for the whole frequency shifter. So if we turn that right down, it's not going to do anything. And then we can slowly mix it in. And then drive is just a distortion. We have this, how loud the drive is and the mix. So that just feeds it back a lot, I guess. And then in shift mode, we just have this frequency here, which is what the LFO is attached to. So if we just start turning that up, it'll start adding all these frequencies, like artifact frequencies, to the original source. So that sounds kind of crazy. So I'll delete that. I'll go to the next one, which is a phaser. The phaser is pretty similar to the flanger, and it's kind of similar, except instead of putting them all harmonically, correctly in phase in the harmonic series, it puts them. It does the same thing as the flanger, but it puts them all out of phase. So if we can imagine, say that tutorial I did on the flanger that is creating your own flanger. Let's say we have 100 hertz as the fundamental, and then 200 hertz is the next one in the harmonic series, and then 300 hertz, and then 400 hertz. Oops, 400 hertz. And then let's say we mapped all these to a macro and started moving around. That would be the flanger. But the phase is slightly different. Let's say we move this one down to 180, we move this one up to 313, and we move this up to 458. Now none of those are harmonically related at all. They're close, but they're slightly different. So it'll sound similar, but they're just slightly out of phase. So they're really similar effects, but they just sound slightly different. So phaser just sounds like this. Whoops. I'll just put that on the channel we want. It's very similar to the flanger. We have a certain amount of poles. I assume this relates to the amount of poles that we have on the EQ. So we have heaps of these peaking and dipping and stuff like that. I assume that's what they mean by poles. So let's say these are all high Q values. And then we turn this down to 4. Let's just say that we take off these last 4, and that's pretty much what that's doing. So then we have an envelope, which is the same as the flanger. It's the same as a compressor as well. It's an attack, a release, and then an amount up to 100%. Feedback and frequency, that's what frequency it's I guess the fundamental frequency, and then the feedback, how high the Q points are on the poles. We have this earth space mode, which just kind of changes the sound a little bit. The flanger is kind of similar. It has this plus and negative mode. I assume it deals with polarity. To me, that sounds like it's putting it out of phase. In earth mode, we have a color, which I think just makes it sound a little bit richer. And then we have an LFO again, same thing as the other LFOs: amount, rate, phase, note value, offset, and spin or phasing modes. So moving on, next thing we have is the ping pong and the filter delay. The ping pong and the simple delay. These are kind of similar effects. The ping pong is like the auto pan in the sense that it delays the signal from the left to the right speakers. So if we put this on sync and put it on 4, I'll just put this back on the single hit. Oops, I'll just turn that channel on. So we can hear that being delayed. It's delaying the right and the left. So what it's doing is it's just taking the output and it's feeding it back into the input and playing it again for us every quarter note. The feedback is how much it does, how long it does this for, or how much the signal gets degraded every time it comes back through the ping pong. So if it outputs, let's say we have the feedback on 50%, it'll output it, put it back in the input, and it'll be 50% quieter. And then that 50% quieter signal will go out the output, come back in the input, and go 50% quieter again. And then we have a time mode, which is kind of similar to the time modes on the filter delay as well. It's not a sync, it's just whatever time you want it to be. So it doesn't relate to this BPM up here at all. And then we have a few different modes on this: repitch, fade, and jump. So jump's pretty standard. It makes it a bit granular sometimes. Fade, that's your most standard mode. It just keeps playing until it gets quieter and dies out. And repitch, as you change, this is the most interesting one, as you change the time of the delay, it pitches the new ones that are coming in up or down depending on which way you're going with the time. So if we play it and we make the time slower, it'll slow down the grains of what's coming back into the delay, and it'll make them either lower in pitch or higher in pitch. And if we turn those up, it'll make them higher in pitch. So that's really cool. The filter delay It also has these options, but I didn't really go into them because I've got to go into them anyway with these other delays. Then we have our simple delay. It's kind of can be used as a ping pong delay, I guess. You have a left and a right, and you can press this link button to link both those sides, so it just becomes a mono delay. So it's just a stereo delay. It's very similar to the ping pong, but instead we have two sides rather than just one that spits the signal into two speakers. And then again we have these repitch, fade and jump modes. So that's that. And then the only couple that I have left is the grain delay and the reverb. And these are probably the hardest ones to understand. So the grain delay is kind of really interesting. You can click on any of these panels here, and then you can modulate this XY pad, and this modulates these values over here. So we'll just put this back to default. So if we just play it, at the moment it's not doing anything. So if we turn the feedback up, this will start to send this output back into the input again. So I'll just turn it up to 50%. So now it's just a regular delay. But as we start turning up this spray, what happens is it turns these extra delays into tiny little grains of sound, and it inputs them back in and does weird stuff to it regarding this frequency knob. So you can hear it's starting to get really granular. So we can click on this sync mode and turn it to time. On this grain delay we don't have these options with the repitch and such, but you can still get some really cool stuff out of it. So that spray's just turned it into lots of little grains. Then there's pitch mode. It turns all those little grains into separate pitches, so it repitches them all separately for us. So if we turn that down, every time it feeds the output back into the input it's minus 13 semitones lower than the last one. And then random pitch just kind of randomizes or modulates this pitch value. So that one's really cool. It's one of my favorite plugins. And then the last one's the reverb, and reverbs are really interesting, hard things to understand. So basically we can break this into 4 sections, or 5 sections rather. We have the input and how this input's processed. It's processed with a low cut filter or a high cut filter, which will just carve the low and high frequencies off it. We can mess with them through these boxes. Here's your cue point, here's your frequencies, or we can just grab this yellow pole and just drag it around. And the only other thing we have in the input is the pre-delay, which is how far away off the original source is the first early reflection. So if we turn this right up to 250 milliseconds, it'll play, and then 250 milliseconds later we'll hear our early reflection. So you can hear that's a distinct echo now, it's almost a delay. And then it goes into this early reflections part, or section 2 of the reverb. If we turn spin and shape on, basically this just shapes the early reflections. And then it goes into these global parameters, so we have eco, mid or high. This is just the quality of the reverb. So eco is the most CPU processor friendly, and high is the most intensive, but it's supposed to be the most richest sounding. So I mean, I can't really tell the difference, so I don't think it's a huge difference. Then size is the size of your room. So if we have it really low, we can imagine that the source is being in a small room, and it sounds kind of metallic. And then if we have it really high, we can imagine that it's in a big hall. You can hear the echoes being quite distant. And then stereos just kind of, if we turn it all the way up to 120, left and right have their own separate things happening in both speakers, and that's kind of how it will work in a real room. But if we turn it right down to 0, the whole thing's being mixed into mono. So we can hear both speakers being separate there. And if we turn it right down, it's just a mono signal that sounds in the center. Following that, it goes into a diffusion network, which is like another low and high cut thing. So we can, after the input processing, we can EQ it again in this diffusion network. You can just turn these off by high and low. In nature, what will happen is the reverb that comes back will be generally lower, depending on the room or the space, I guess. And then if we turn the decay time up, this is how long it decays for after the first pre-delay. So 16 seconds it'll delay for there. If we EQ this up a bit, turn these off, turn this pre-delay down. So we can hear that's a pretty long decay now. Freeze freezes the decay. So that'll just happen forever now until we turn that off. Then after that it goes into this chorus section, which is kind of a part of this diffusion network, and this just modulates the sound a little bit. Kind of just adds modulation. We have a scale and a density knob which just kind of shapes this chorus. Does some cool stuff. And then we have a reflection, diffusion and dry wet control. So dry wet is pretty much 100% as completely wet signal. We won't hear any of the original source. And then 0% is nothing, we'll just hear original source. If you're using it on a send track, you should probably put it at 100%. So if we go return track, we'll chuck this on the return. Oops, there we go. So now it's on a return track. We'll just make this pre-fader. We should make this 100% now, because now this level over here becomes our dry wet. So I'll just keep going through this. So the reflection, reflect is how loud the reflections are, and diffusion is kind of how loud the reflections are also, or how loud the diffusion network is. So we just turn this down. We can hear that the reflections are quite loud, and if we turn those right down, we can hear that the reflections are really quiet now. So that's pretty much all the time-based effects that Ableton offers are. And yeah, hopefully you got something out of that. I hope you're enjoying this series. And yeah, until next time, take it easy.